What if the way you think about thinking is completely wrong? And in just 30 days, your mind could be rebuilt from the ground up? Roger Penrose, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, was never known just for intelligence. What made his mind feel different was something deeper. He didn't just collect information like most people do. He saw hidden order inside chaos. Where others saw scattered facts, he saw structure. Where others stopped at confusion, he kept going until patterns began to appear. And here is the unsettling idea behind this entire process. That same ability is not reserved for genius minds. It can be trained. Slowly, step by step, your brain can be pushed to think in a similar way in just 30 days. But the process doesn't begin comfortably. In fact, it starts with something most people misunderstand completely. Around day 6, something strange begins to happen inside your mind. Ideas you were once confident about start to fall apart. Concepts you thought you understood become unclear when you try to explain them. Even simple topics begin to feel unstable when you put them into words. You start a sentence with confidence, but halfway through, it collapses. For most people, this is where the process ends. They assume they are not smart enough. They feel frustrated, confused, even embarrassed, so they quit. But that reaction is exactly the mistake. Because what feels like mental failure is actually the beginning of real learning. It is the moment your brain stops pretending to understand and starts rebuilding understanding from scratch. Psychologists call this desirable difficulty. But in reality, it is much more powerful than the name suggests. It is the point where shallow knowledge collapses so real structure can be formed underneath. At this stage, your brain is not breaking down. It is reorganizing. And the method that triggers this change is almost too simple to be taken seriously. You pick any topic, something like black holes, gravity, or even consciousness. Then you try to explain it out loud as if you are teaching it to someone with no background at all. A curious child, for example. Every time your explanation fails, you stop, you go back, you study again, you correct the gap, then you try once more. That's it. No complex system, no expensive course, no hidden technique. And because it looks so simple, most people underestimate it. That is why they fail. Modern brains are trained for speed, not depth. We scroll, we consume, we recognize. But recognition is not understanding. On day 1, this becomes painfully clear. You choose a topic you believe you know. You start explaining it. At first, it feels easy. Familiar words come out naturally. But very quickly, something shifts. You realize you are repeating phrases, not explaining meaning. You are using language that sounds correct, but doesn't actually hold structure. When you try to go deeper, the explanation collapses. This is where the illusion breaks. Psychologists call it the illusion of competence. The brain mistakes familiarity for understanding. You hear a term many times, see it in videos, read it in articles, and assume you know it. But when you try to rebuild it from memory alone, the gaps appear instantly. And those gaps are not a problem. They are the signal. Because every gap forces your brain to activate deeper learning systems. Neurons begin to reorganize. Connections start shifting. The mind is no longer storing information, it is reconstructing it. And that is where the real transformation begins. Because once those gaps appear in your understanding, something powerful is triggered inside your brain. It doesn't feel impressive at first. In fact, it feels uncomfortable, even frustrating. But this is exactly where real learning begins to take shape. Every time you fail to explain something clearly, your brain is forced to confront the difference between hearing information and actually understanding it. And that difference changes everything. A few days into the process, something subtle starts to happen. Concepts that once felt completely separate begin to overlap in unexpected ways. Ideas don't stay isolated anymore. They start connecting. At first, it is almost unnoticeable. You might be thinking about something like black holes, and suddenly it reminds you of something in human behavior. Or you study entropy in physics, and it starts to resemble patterns in society. It feels strange, almost accidental, but it isn't. What is happening is that your brain is slowly reorganizing how it stores knowledge. Instead of keeping facts in separate boxes, it begins building links between them. And those links are where deeper understanding emerges. This is the same kind of thinking that made Roger Penrose different from most scientists. He wasn't simply memorizing equations or repeating established ideas. He was constantly looking for hidden structures that connected different areas of reality. Where most people saw separate subjects, he saw one continuous framework underneath. By day 7, however, the process becomes more demanding. Mental fatigue starts to build, not the kind of tiredness that comes from lack of sleep, but a deeper kind of exhaustion, the feeling that your brain is working harder than it is used to. And this is where most people make another mistake. They interpret this fatigue as failure. They assume they are not progressing, because even though the effort is increasing, the results are not immediately visible. It feels like nothing is improving. This phase is known as the learning plateau, and it is one of the most dangerous stages in the entire process, not because it harms you, but because it tests your patience. A quiet thought begins to appear in your mind. Maybe this is too hard. Maybe I am not capable of this level of thinking. But that voice is misleading, because beneath the surface, something extremely important is happening. Your brain is strengthening neural pathways that you cannot yet feel. Repeated mental effort is wrapping those connections in myelin, a biological process that increases the speed and efficiency of thought. In simple terms, your mind is literally building faster communication between neurons. It is like turning slow dirt paths into structured highways inside your brain. But biology does not rush this process, it takes time. And if you continue through this stage instead of quitting, something begins to shift around the second week. Not suddenly, but noticeably. The ideas that once felt confusing start to feel slightly more stable. You can hold them in your mind for longer without losing them. You begin to explain things with less hesitation. The fog is still there, but it is thinning. And then comes an important realization. Understanding is not about collecting more information. It is about removing confusion until only structure remains. By day 11, something even more surprising happens. A topic that once felt overwhelming starts to feel familiar. You can now explain parts of it without notes. Not because you memorized it, but because it has started to integrate into your thinking. It no longer feels like something you studied. It feels like something you can see. And that shift marks the beginning of real comprehension. And once a topic stops feeling like something you studied and starts feeling like something you can see, the entire direction of your thinking begins to change. Because now, knowledge is no longer sitting outside your mind. It is starting to become part of how your mind operates. You are no longer just recalling information, you are rebuilding it in real time. Around this stage, something very important becomes clear. When you truly understand something, you don't need complicated language to explain it. In fact, the opposite becomes true. The deeper your understanding goes, the simpler your explanation becomes. This is why clarity is not a sign of shallow thinking. It is actually a sign of deep structure. By day 11 and onward, you begin to notice that your explanations are cleaner. You are no longer reaching for complicated terms just to sound correct. Instead, you are focusing on meaning. And when meaning becomes clear, the unnecessary complexity disappears on its own. This is also where your relationship with confusion begins to change. Earlier, confusion felt like a warning sign, something to avoid, something that meant you were not smart enough or not ready yet. But now, something different starts to happen inside your mind. Confusion stops feeling like a wall. It starts feeling like a doorway. Instead of pulling back when something becomes difficult, your attention naturally moves toward it. You begin to stay longer with questions that don't have immediate answers. And that shift is extremely important because most people never learn to do this. They avoid discomfort. They move away from uncertainty. But real understanding only exists on the other side of confusion. By day 15, this change becomes even more noticeable. Your mindset starts shifting from ego-based learning to curiosity-based learning. You are no longer trying to appear intelligent even to yourself. You are trying to understand what is actually true. And that difference changes everything. Because when ego stops controlling learning, curiosity becomes dominant. And curiosity is what drives real discovery. This is the same mindset that led thinkers like Roger Penrose to explore questions most people avoid. Questions about consciousness, reality, mathematics, and the structure of the universe. Not because answers were easy, but because the questions themselves reveal deeper layers of reality. At this point in your training, your brain begins doing something very interesting. It stops treating information as isolated facts and starts treating it as connected systems. You are no longer learning topics. You are learning relationships between ideas. And that is where the transformation accelerates. Between days 16 and 22, something begins to happen that feels almost invisible at first, but it changes everything about how you think. Your brain starts recognizing patterns instead of memorizing details. This is a major shift, because memorization depends on repetition, but pattern recognition depends on structure. And structure is far more powerful than memory alone. Now, when you encounter a new idea, your mind doesn't treat it as something completely new. Instead, it searches for connections. It asks silently, where have I seen this structure before? And suddenly, connections begin to appear everywhere. Physics starts to resemble systems in nature. Mathematics feels less like formulas and more like language. Even human behavior starts to reflect patterns that appear in science. Everything begins to feel less random and more connected. At this stage, learning stops being linear. It becomes network-based. And this is where your thinking begins to resemble the way advanced minds operate. Roger Penrose is often associated with this kind of perception, not because he memorized more than others, but because he trained himself to see deeper structural relationships between seemingly unrelated fields. Instead of focusing on surface-level facts, he focused on underlying frameworks. By day 20, even the way you consume information changes. Reading becomes faster, but not because you are rushing. It becomes faster because your mind is no longer processing word by word. It is recognizing full structures at once. Ideas connect instantly to previous knowledge, instead of being stored separately. It is as if your mental architecture has been reorganized, and then you enter the final phase of this transformation. In the last week, something unexpected happens. Learning no longer feels like effort. It starts feeling like expansion. Your mind stops resisting complexity and begins moving toward it naturally. Problems that once felt heavy now feel engaging. Difficult topics no longer trigger avoidance. Instead, they trigger curiosity. And something else changes too. Your memory improves, but not in the way people expect. You are not memorizing more. You are remembering more naturally because understanding has replaced repetition. When something is truly understood, it stays. By day 22, even your questions begin to evolve. You stop asking only what does this mean and start asking why does this structure exist or what connects these ideas beneath the surface. And that shift is critical because the quality of your thinking is defined by the quality of your questions. At this point, you are no longer just learning information. You are learning how to think in structures. And once your questions begin to change, your entire relationship with intelligence begins to shift as well. Because now you are no longer satisfied with surface explanations. You don't just want definitions anymore. You want structure. You want the underlying logic that holds ideas together. Around this stage, something very subtle but powerful happens in your daily life. You start noticing that most conversations are built on repetition rather than understanding. People often repeat phrases they have heard, but when asked to explain them deeply, the structure collapses. And now you can see that difference clearly. By day 24, learning itself feels different. It no longer feels like something you force yourself to do. It starts to feel like exploration. Your mind begins to move toward complexity instead of away from it. Difficulty is no longer a warning sign. It is an invitation. This is where identity begins to shift. You stop labeling yourself as smart or not smart. Instead, you start seeing yourself as someone who can develop understanding through process. And that is a crucial change because it removes one of the biggest mental barriers in learning, fixed identity thinking. Most people stop learning deeply not because they lack ability, but because they decide too early that something is beyond them. But in reality, the issue is rarely intelligence. It is approach. It is depth of attention. It is persistence inside confusion. And once you understand that, your entire mindset changes. By day 27, even conversations start to feel different. You listen more carefully. You notice contradictions more quickly. You can tell when someone truly understands a topic and when they are simply repeating information they heard elsewhere. And something unexpected happens as well. You lose the need to impress people with complex language, because when you understand something deeply, you don't need to prove it. In fact, simplicity becomes more powerful than complexity. This is something Roger Penrose demonstrated through his own way of thinking. The deepest ideas in physics and mathematics are often expressed in surprisingly simple forms, not because reality is simple on the surface, but because true understanding removes unnecessary layers. By the final week, something even more profound occurs. Thinking itself becomes more natural. You are no longer fighting your own mind to understand difficult ideas. Instead, your mind begins to cooperate with you. Complex topics no longer feel heavy, they feel navigable. And then comes the final transformation. Around day 30, something quiet but powerful happens. You realize you can now explain complex ideas in simple language without losing meaning. You can take something like black holes, time, consciousness, or artificial intelligence and express it in a way that feels clear and structured. Not because you memorized explanations, but because you built understanding from the inside out. And in that moment, something becomes obvious. You were never becoming smarter in the traditional sense. You were learning how to think more deeply, more clearly, and more structurally. And that changes everything. Because once you experience that level of clarity, you cannot go back to surface-level thinking in the same way. You start seeing patterns everywhere. You question more, you assume less. You observe longer. And perhaps the most important realization arrives quietly. Intelligence is not a fixed trait, it is a practice, a process of continuously refining how you interpret reality. Roger Penrose spent his life exploring questions most people avoid. Not because he had all the answers, but because he understood something fundamental. The universe is not just something to memorize. It is something to understand. And that is exactly what this 30-day process reveals to you. Now, if this idea challenged the way you think, don't stop here. Take one topic you have always found confusing. Write it down. Try to explain it in the simplest possible way. as if you were teaching it to someone who has never heard of it before. Then repeat the process every day, because if you do, you won't just learn more. You will begin to think differently. And that is where real transformation begins.